Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. Today I'm going to be talking about class and money in the work of Jane Austen. Before I get into things, this video is going to have spoilers for all of Jane Austen's 6 novels: Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion. There will be no spoilers for Lady Susan, which is her 7th novel slash novella, because I know a lot of people have read her 6 main novels and not Lady Susan, so I'm not going to include that. But those other 6 novels, if you haven't read them slash watched TV and film adaptations and you don't want to know what happens in them, I advise you go away and do not watch this video. It will be heavy on the spoilers. So, let's begin. If you were sensible of your own good, you would not wish to quit the sphere in which you have been brought up. In marrying your nephew, I should not consider myself as quitting that sphere. He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal. So, today I want to talk about the role of class and money in Jane Austen's books. I want to talk a little bit about the role money has in the plot, and I want to talk a little bit about the way that kind of class operates into her books, the class that she chooses to write about, and the kind of class uncertainty within the class that she chooses to write about. Rank and class and money are all hugely important in Jane Austen's books, and she's very, very precise about them. It's interesting to note that Jane Austen gives a lot of characters incomes, like how much they have a year, and that she was very precise about this. So we know from lots of her letters that, like, just before the publication of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, she went through and like updated the incomes to make sure they were all correct, because how much money characters have and earn is very, very important in the book, because money and class and rank and status and so on play such an important role in Jane Austen's work. The first thing I want to talk about is the extent to which money drives the plots of Jane Austen's books. In Pride and Prejudice, the reason why Mrs. Bennet wants her daughters to get married, the reason why her daughters themselves are kind of interested in getting married, is because Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed away from the female line. The person who is going to inherit is his male cousin, Mr. Collins, and therefore if his daughters do not find men to marry who can support them, they will literally have no house after Mr. Bennet's death. None of the 5 girls are incredibly well educated. They never had a governess and their mother didn't teach them very much, so while they may be knowledgeable to a certain extent, they don't know enough to go out as governesses, which is about the only like respectable thing you can do to earn money as a woman of this class at that time, and even then it's not that respectable. Hence the reason why a character like Jane Fairfax in Emma really doesn't want to go out and be a governess. So the whole kind of plot of Pride and Prejudice is driven by money. The opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice is, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife." It being very important here that it is a single man of good fortune. Money is completely at the centre and drives so much of the plot. The same in Sense and Sensibility. The thing that opens the book of Sense and Sensibility is the death of the Dashwood girls' father, and when he dies, his estate goes to his eldest son, their half-brother. They get nothing because the estate is entailed and he cannot leave them anything because they are women, and therefore they are forced to move away from their father's estate and to live in a cottage. This begins the whole book, and a lot of the issues in this book surround the fact that the Dashwoods have no money. That's what drives the plot along. In Northanger Abbey, money also plays a central role in the plot. Money and the belief that Catherine Morland has money is what makes General Tilney like her, and then when he finds out she doesn't have as much money as he thought, take a great distaste to her instead. Mansfield Park, I think, is in a way the book of Jane Austen's that is the most about money and class. Fanny Price's family have very little money, and therefore she is sent away to live with her wealthy cousin, where she is treated by a lot of them like a second-class citizen, like somewhere between a servant and a member of the family. Emma in Emma is one of the few of Jane Austen's heroines who actually has lots of money of her own, and therefore, because she has no need or no wish to marry, because she has money of her own, she starts matchmaking everyone else around her because she is bored. Persuasion, the plot again is kicked off by money. The lack of money in the Elliot family, the fact that Sir Walter Elliot has just spent all his money, that is what means that they have to decamp to Bath, which starts the plot and gets Anne moving in different circles and living in different places. Like, so much of Jane Austen is about money. To my mind, Jane Austen's books are as much, if not more, about money than they are about marriage. Another thing that is incredibly important throughout Jane Austen's books is the relationship between money and gender, and the fact that women cannot or rarely have the same financial resources as men. The entailed estate is a big deal in Jane Austen's books, especially in Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, where these women who come from the gentry will not be able to support themselves without a husband because their father's estate is entailed away from the female line. And it's interesting and important to note that Jane Austen's heroine who has the least interest in marriage is Emma, the only one who who has money of her own and who therefore kind of can afford not to marry if she chooses not to. Marriage and money are always bound up in Jane Austen's book. I read the first line of Pride and Prejudice, which is so famous, which immediately from the first page of that novel connects marriage and money. They are always bound up together, partly because it is the main way in which women of the class that Jane Austen writes about, women in the kind of upper, middle and upper classes, could get money and could like have a life and a home of their own. If you look at a character like Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice, she feels that she is a drain on her family, that she doesn't want to live there anymore. She wants to have a house of her own. The only way for her to have a house of her own and to not be a financial drain on her parents is to get married, because that is the only option that she has. In general, Jane Austen writes about the gentry and the aristocracy, mostly with a focus on the gentry, though some of her books are more aristocratic than others. But even when Jane Austen writes about the aristocracy, she tends to write about like baronets rather than like lords and dukes. Most of her aristocratic families come from like the lower ends of the aristocracy. I'm not going to go into a long detail about like rank and order of rank, but I think all you need to know really for this video is like a baronet is like the lowest kind of titled person. So if you're a baronet, you'll be Sir Walter Elliot, for example, but you wouldn't have a seat in the House of Lords, you wouldn't be a peer, though you are kind of an aristocrat, so you have a title, but you're not like as high as barons and lords and marquises and earls and dukes. Lots of titles, not very many of which turn up in Jane Austen. So in general, the characters Jane Austen focuses on are the upper middle class and the lower upper class, as it were. So in Pride and Prejudice, our heroines Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet are both daughters of a member of the landed gentry. Elizabeth marries a much more wealthy member of the landed gentry, Mr. Darcy, and Jane Bennet marries a man who becomes a part of the landed gentry, who has made his money in trade but a few generations back, and both of them marry above them in terms of wealth and certainly for Elizabeth in terms of status as well. In Sense and Sensibility, we also follow two women who are daughters of a member of the landed gentry. Eleanor ends up marrying a clergyman, Marianne ends up marrying a member of the landed gentry. So Marianne kind of marries equal / above herself in that way, because Colonel Brandon has a lot of money and she does not, and Eleanor marries sort of fairly equally to her, in the clergyman as sort of in the upper middle-ish class, depending. There's a big spectrum of clergymen in the 19th century, but Edward Ferrars is kind of comfortable and respectable. In Northanger Abbey, our heroine is a clergyman's daughter who doesn't come from that much money, and she ends up marrying a clergyman who is a little above her in terms of having more financial security and kind of coming from a better, grander, richer family than her, but he is a clergyman, she's a clergyman's daughter, so they're kind of equal in that sense. In Mansfield Park, Fanny Price is the daughter of a man in the Navy, and she has absolutely no money, comes from absolutely no money, but she marries a clergyman who is the son of a baronet, so she marries definitely above her. Emma is a daughter of the gentry, and the only of Jane Austen's heroines who actually has a lot of money of her own, and she also marries someone in the gentry. She marries Mr. Knightley, who is completely her equal in terms of wealth and status and class, which is slightly unusual because most of Jane Austen's heroines marry like slightly above them and are kind of elevated by their husbands' positions in society. In Persuasion, however, we have our highest classed heroine, Anne is the daughter of a baronet, so she is the kind of highest in terms of class and rank in comparison to Jane Austen's other heroines, but she has no money because her father has spent it all. She marries a captain in the Navy who is, according to rank, her social inferior, which is the only time in Jane Austen that happens. And important too to note that one of the reasons for the whole sort of plot of Persuasion is that when Anne Elliot was 19 years old, her godmother persuaded her that she should not marry Captain Wentworth because he had few prospects and was not a fit husband for the daughter of a baronet. Now he has made a name for himself, but he is a self-made man and he does not come from a particularly well-established family. So in that sense, Anne Elliot is the only person who sort of marries beneath her. So it's interesting to see kind of where all of her heroines sit in terms of class and rank and status. Jane Austen's heroines, all with the exception of Fanny Price, come from families in the kind of upper middle and lower upper classes. Fanny Price, I would say, more comes from a family in the middle class. Like, her father is connected with the Navy, but her family do not have very much money at all, and they're a very different class to a lot of the other characters we see in Jane Austen's books. So yeah, in general, Jane Austen's heroines come from the upper middle and lower upper classes, and the majority of Jane Austen's heroines, though, interestingly, though they come from that place in society, have very, very little money, and this is, like I've mentioned, often a driving force in the book. And Emma is the only one of her heroines who actually has like a fortune of her own to fall back on. It's also worth noting that in Jane Austen, aristocrats never come off well. If we think of the aristocratic characters we have in Jane Austen's books, like Sir Walter Elliot or Sir Thomas Bertram or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, they are by no means the most sympathetic characters in those books. It's interesting to note that while Jane Austen mostly writes about the gentry and people in the professions, so people who work as clergymen or in the navy or the army, while the majority of the people she writes about do come from landed families, there's still a lot of class tension and like class uncertainty within the classes that she writes about. There are two like divisions that I want to explain before I go any further. One is the division between town and county families. Let me explain. This is a thing throughout the 19th century, and once you are aware of it, you will notice it in so many 19th century novels. Families who owned an estate or land around a town were referred to in the 19th century as a county family, like they were a family of the county. And then people that lived like on the street in the town were called like townsfolk or townspeople. So there's a division between like town and county families. So in Pride and Prejudice, for example, the Bennets are a county family, but Mrs. Bennet's sister, who lives in the town, is a member of the town. She is not a member of the county family, so therefore she's like much less well respected. In Emma and her father are like a county family, but Miss Bates and so on in the town, they are not. They are people in the town. Another division at this time is the division between like country and town. And here I mean town not as in a town, but I mean as in London. So you'll notice in Pride and Prejudice there is a lot of snobbery from the Bingleys towards the Bennets over the fact that the Bingleys go to London for the season and the Bennets do not. And that is a big mark of rank. Like the higher up you are in society, the more likely you are to go to London for the season and to spend like several months a year socialising in London. Whereas if you're not as wealthy, then you won't get to do that. You'll just stay in the countryside. You don't have the money to go to London every year. So that is like a big division between the Bennets and like the Bingleys / Mr. Darcy. It's the division between like going to town and staying in the country when the season is happening. I hope that made sense. Anyway, it's really interesting to notice the kind of class clash which does exist within Jane Austen's work, despite the fact that she mostly writes about what is not a huge section of society. In Persuasion, Sir Walter Elliot is incredibly condescending and patronising and very, very dismissive of anyone who he views as even slightly below himself. He doesn't like men who work in the Navy, even though the Navy is very, very respectable at this time, because he thinks that them kind of doing any work at all and being paid to do work is kind of a disgrace. And he's incredibly dismissive and rude about Anne's friend Mrs. Smith because she is not wealthy. In Pride and Prejudice, there is a lot about rank and class and a lot of clashes here, including Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley's efforts to persuade Mr. Bingley not to marry Jane because she is his social inferior, and Mr. Darcy himself and his scruples about marrying Lizzie and because of how ill-connected she is and the fact that she has no money and he has an awful lot. And then of course we have that wonderful discussion that I quoted from at the beginning of this video between Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Elizabeth Bennet, where Lady Catherine basically says, "You are not good enough for my nephew because you are not from the same class as him," and she's like, "No, I am." And that moment is really, really important because Elizabeth is claiming equality with Mr. Darcy because he is a gentleman and she is a gentleman's daughter, despite the fact that he is of sort of much greater wealth and rank than her, and that is kind of really important in terms of a little like clash of class. In Emma is very scathing and dismissive of those who are poorer than her. She kind of takes it on herself to guide and lead Harriet Smith because she thinks that as a woman of wealth and consequence she has a kind of right to tell Harriet what to do, but she's also incredibly dismissive of the fact that Harriet Smith wants to marry a man called Mr. Martin who is a farmer, because that, as far as Emma is concerned, is not someone worthy of a friend of hers. She's also incredibly dismissive of Miss Bates. Miss Bates lives with her mother in a house in the town of Highbury. I think they have 1 or 2 servants. Miss Bates is still described as a gentlewoman. She is still in the upper middle class, but she doesn't have very much money, and Emma, being incredibly wealthy, really looks down on her. And then there's also Mansfield Park, which in my opinion is like the most about class of any of Jane Austen's novels, where we have Fanny Price, who is of a different class to her cousins and her aunt and uncle who she lives with, and the way that she is treated because of that, especially the way Mrs. Norris treats her, is incredibly interesting. She is treated as above the servants but below the rest of the house in this weird social position of her own. She is treated incredibly badly by Mrs. Norris, and sometimes her family include her in activities like she is one of the family, and sometimes they don't. And whenever they do include her, Mrs. Norris is always like, "Oh, Fanny should be really grateful that she's here and shouldn't expect anything better." The way they treat Fanny Price in this and her kind of exclusion from the family because of her class and her having not as much money as them, the kind of separation kept between her and her cousins, is really, really interesting and important. And yeah, Mansfield Park's a really interesting Jane Austen book if you're interested in class and social position. The final thing I wanted to bring up today is those people in Jane Austen who are not members of the upper upper, middle and lower upper classes. Poverty and the working classes are seen pretty infrequently in Jane Austen, even like shopkeepers and so on. We don't get to see many of them, but it is important to take note where these things do come up, and it's important as well to take note that being kind to people of social classes beneath you is considered very much a virtue in Jane Austen's books everywhere it comes up. It doesn't come up that much, but when it does, it's very important. In Mansell Park, the first time Fanny Price starts to think slightly better about Henry Crawford is when he says he's going to do something good for his tenants, and she's glad, and it makes her feel that maybe he could be a good person after all if he's going to look after the people on his estate better. And one of the things that changes Elizabeth Bennet's mind about Mr. Darcy is when they're going round the house in Pemberley and Mrs. Darcy's housekeeper praises him so highly. Jane Austen writes, "What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant?" And that sentence is really, really important because we don't see servants that much in Jane Austen, but it's very important that here Jane Austen is basically saying that if a servant thinks highly of someone, that probably means that they are a good person. If they're a good master, they're probably a good person, and that is important. The role of servants in Jane Austen's books is really interesting as a whole because servants are everywhere in Jane Austen. They are often mentioned, they often appear, they often play an important role, especially if we take an example such as Lydia's kind of scandal elopement in Pride and Prejudice and what follows. One of the Bennets' kind of greatest fears is that soon all the servants will know, and this is a great worry for them because they really kind of keep this secret and this scandal away from the servants. The lack of privacy in a house with servants is kind of interestingly explored here, but also the servants suddenly play quite an important role at this point in terms of spreading news around the house. In chapter 49 in Pride and Prejudice, the reason why Elizabeth and Jane find out that Mr. Bennet has had a letter and find out that there is news of their sister is because the housekeeper comes and tells them so. They then run into the house to try and find their father, and when they can't find him, it's the butler who tells them where he is. Servants do play important roles in the household. Another thing I think is worth taking note of, which is quite interesting, and one thing John Mullen talks about in his book What Matters in Jane Austen, my favourite Jane Austen related non-fiction book. It's really, really good, you should read it if you haven't. One thing he talks about in there, he has a chapter on the presence or absence of the lower classes in Jane Austen's works, and one thing he raises is that you always know a character is bad in Jane Austen where they spend a lot of time talking about or talking to their servants and kind of interfering in their servants' lives. Characters like Mrs. Price in Mansell Park, Mary Musgrove in Persuasion, Mrs. Elton in Emma and Mrs. Norris in Mansell Park spend a lot of time interfering in their servants' lives, complaining about their servants and talking about their servants all the time. And this kind of interfering in the lives of the people they employ is definitely kind of used by Jane Austen as a code for characters who are bad. You know a character's not very nice and is a bit interfering and judgmental if they're constantly complaining about their servants. And the implication is, I think, that the reason why these people are complaining about their servants is because they are not very good at running the house themselves. But also Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Elton's interference in their servants' lives is kind of shown as kind of them over interfering in the lives of people who they should just leave alone to kind of do their job because that is what servants are doing. And it's kind of interesting to note therefore that Jane Austen doesn't interfere in the lives of the servants in her books. I think that's all I wanted to say today. I don't have so much of a conclusion in this video as I did in my video about marriage in Jane Austen, but I just wanted to say that I find the way money and rank and class are explored in Jane Austen really, really interesting and very, very important to her work. Class and rank and money all play a very important role in her books and are very, very interesting to look at. Just before I go, I would also like to recommend Joe Baker's book Longbourn, which is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of the servants in the house, which I think is a really interesting look at what it was like to be a servant in the early 19th century. But it's also quite an interesting interpretation of the glimpses of servants that we do get in Pride and Prejudice, so I would just like to recommend that as something that may be of interest if you found this video interesting. And that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about class and money in Jane Austen, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.